This video will delve into what I, Paulo, consider the fundamental problem of Marxism, materialism. This video explores various facets of this topic. We'll examine communism, Marxism, and materialism, along with the core issue of materialism itself. We'll also touch upon different materialist schools of thought, Marx's doctoral thesis, some of Engels' considerations, and explore hypothetical scenarios to better understand these reflections I'm proposing. If my arguments aren't perfectly clear, perhaps the examples will make everything more comprehensible. Let's start with communism. Communism is a political ideology that emerged in the 19th century. Its objective was to establish a classless society, where all means of production and everything produced would be common property of all members of society. Private property would be replaced by public ownership. Communism is inherently totalitarian, aiming to subjugate the entire society to its ideology and the exclusive leadership of the Communist Party. The Germans Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels laid the groundwork for communist ideology, envisioning it as a social formation that would succeed capitalism. This would be built after a violent global revolution originating in the most developed capitalist countries. The most progressive class, the proletariat, led by the Communist Party, would establish communism under the conditions of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Curiously, the state was supposed to disappear over time in a communist society. Communism is also seen as an equalizing and redemptive ideology with its own original sin, the exploitation of one person by another, and the paradise it promises. Within a communist society, its exclusively valid truth is that an enemy of the progressive working class exists, and this enemy must be destroyed at all costs, using any means to achieve this end. It's important to note that the construction of socialism as a prerequisite for the communist system of social organization involves a focused and violent modernization of society. In summary, contrary to Marx and Engels' predictions, communists often came to power in economically backward countries with a large proportion of rural population and without the participation of the lower classes. This logic persists today in developing and emerging countries, formerly known as third world countries, which currently take Marxism and communist ideas more seriously. Generally, two distinctions of communism are made: real communism, materialized in the concrete world which has failed 100% of the time, and ideal communism. The latter is defended with an air of purity, and for Marxists it can only exist in a virginal and abstract contact with reality. It's always an eschatological, prescriptive future that must be pursued, even through infinite failures or despite them. Unfortunately, communists and Marxists have never faced a just Nuremberg tribunal, which partly contributes to the current state of affairs. What is Marxism? Marxism is the name of a social theory founded by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in the 19th century. Its goal is a revolutionary transformation of society based on Hegel's dialectical system, the labor theory of value from economist Ricardo Robertus, and Ricardian socialists. The notion of class struggle in the works of Louis Blanc, Proudhon, and Weitling, and the revolutionary strategies of Danton and other Jacobin leaders of the French Revolution. It also incorporates Epicurus sensationalism, Democritus mechanism to some extent, and the foundation of historical materialism from Feuerbach and Arnold Ruge. There's also a scientific experimental attempt in which Marxists seek to achieve revolution through various paths, resembling a scientist who, after failing, tries to reproduce their experiment in many other ways to achieve the desired result. However, this movement cannot be labeled scientific, being closer to phrenology than to science. It's not scientific, not only due to its predictive incapacity and enormous number of failures, but also because of its language marked by unfalsifiable collectivizations, reifications, hypostases, illogic, and authors' misunderstanding of what constitutes proof, as they confuse thesis and proof with correlations about social facts. This pretense of being considered science was intended by Marx in opposition to what was called utopian socialism. In my understanding, this pretense is one of the elements that give Marxism its longevity. Thus, we understand that the Marxists Objective is to fight for the establishment of the Marxist utopia, not to bring good to the people as their propaganda insists. What is materialism? In philosophy, materialism refers to the doctrine that no substance exists other than matter. This is a monist position that contrasts with dualism. Dualism allows for the existence of two different substances, such as mind and matter. The term emerged in the second half of the 17th century to denote philosophies that deny the existence of mental substances or souls, recognizing only the existence of physical substances, the first sentence of Friedrich Lang's History of Materialism. The reference work on the subject in the 19th century states, "Materialism is as old as philosophy, but no older." Lang is referring to the pre-Socratic philosopher Democritus, often recognized as a proponent of physicalism or materialism, as he famously declared, "Everything is atoms and the void." This perspective, similar to Democritus, resurfaced at the beginning of the modern era, shortly before Newton, through philosophers and scientists like Thomas Hobbes. In the 19th century, Karl Marx's dialectical materialism developed his social philosophy against what we would today call physicalism. Marx's doctoral thesis and Epicurus Untestally. Marx's doctoral thesis was a comparison between the materialists Democritus and Epicurus. In Karl Marx's doctoral thesis, three philosophical positions are assumed: Democritus' mechanistic materialism, Hegel's system, and the philosophy of self-consciousness or man by Epicurus and the young Hegelians, the preference for self-consciousness. Marked by Epicurus' philosophy, stands out in the thesis privileging human freedom, which breaks with Democritus, representing its antithesis with a mechanistic reading of history. It is important to emphasize that Epicurus' sensationalism, considered the criterion of truth, serves as a starting point for Marx's materialism, which opposes Hegel's absolute idealism. Epicurus' sensationalism refers to the emphasis on sensory perception as the criterion for truth. Simply put, what I feel and grasp through my senses is the truth. This idea is related to Epicurean philosophy, centered on the pursuit of pleasure and ataraxia tranquility. Epicurus argued that sensory perception, hence the term sensus, that is, information received through the senses, is the fundamental criterion for determining truth. It was believed that sensations, when interpreted correctly, provided an accurate understanding of reality. Notice how this theory approaches the standpoint theory that denies the existence or value of a priori knowledge developed by others, or even theoretical knowledge to some extent, emphasizing practical knowledge. As a materialist, Epicurus was skeptical of excessive philosophical abstractions that could not be based on direct sensory experience. Earlier philosophers, such as the Eleatics, sometimes based their theories on purely logical arguments, which Epicurus rejected if not grounded in sensible experience. Epicurus applied his sensationalism not only to ontological but also to ethical and religious questions. He criticized the fear of gods and the unknown, arguing that such fears were unfounded and based on irrational speculations, a tendency we will see in materialists, including Marx. We can also consider this the root of the judgment that religious people who fear hell are foolish, although these same people don't consider feeling materialistic fear as foolish. For example, they would consider it smart to fear going up a hill in a favela dominated by drug dealers or to respect the police and federal authorities. The importance of materialism for Marxists. By now, you might have realized that materialism is, for me, the worst problem of Marxism, as the title suggests, and as I stated earlier, I'll explain why later. For now, we know that materialism is important for Marxists, even for those religious people who claim to be theists. The Stalinist compendium designates dialectical and historical materialism as the theoretical foundation of the party and the theoretical foundation of communism. For alienist Marxist philosophy, Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Stalin attribute enormous foundational value to philosophical materialism and the dialectical method for the practical revolutionary activity of the proletariat's party. Marxism is not merely the theory of socialism, Stalin wrote in 1906, but a conception of the world, a philosophical system from which Marx's proletarian socialism emanates. This philosophical system is called dialectical materialism. For Marxist-Leninists, there's a struggle between materialism and idealism throughout the history of philosophy. He also considers the greatest problem in philosophy to be the relationship between thinking and being. Thus, Marxists will generally side with materialist and atomist thinkers and sophists, and in direct opposition to idealist, realist thinkers and philosophers who destroyed sophism. Look at that, it's quite something. This idea is still very curious, as I've had professors who prided themselves on identifying as followers of the sophists, recognizing that postmodern thought has much influence from sophism, treating this as a good thing. For some, all of contemporary philosophy is a development of sophist premises. Well, on that point, I think it's an exaggeration, considering Europe and the United States, but that's another story. Now, reading some philosophy compendiums elaborated by Soviet Marxists, it becomes clear why many think this way in these texts. We find not only the biased use of adjectives to influence the reader, but we even find blatant and absurdly anachronistic lies. This reminds me of college, talking to communist or socialist classmates, or those sympathetic to communism or Marxists, without defining these terms too well. Some of these manipulations were made by Stalin, for example, people disappearing from photographs, or the case of photographer Yevgeny Kalday, who added figures of Soviet officers raising the red flag over the Reichstag in Germany to hide Soviet soldiers who appeared in the original photo looting a building. They not only knew about these things but saw no problem with this kind of deceptive propaganda, but of course they saw a huge problem with the possibility of their political opponents doing the same, and this is a trope in Marxism. It's a way of thinking resulting from the developments of materialism, and that's what I want to demonstrate in this video. Democritus materialismi, greatest materialist of the ancient world was Democritus. Born in Abdera, Thrace, around 470 BCE, he lived many years, until 380 or 370 BCE like Marx. He also received a large inheritance and undertook many long journeys, according to various testimonies. He was in Babylon, Persia, and Egypt. Later, he settled in Athens, where he encountered Socrates' idealist philosophy according to the Soviets, and became his most determined adversary. I'll emphasize this point again. Democritus, whom Marx admired and was inspired by, was an adversary of Socrates, whom he saw as an idealist. Democritus also spoke out against the political conceptions of Socrates and Plato. Democritus was a disciple and successor of the Ionian philosopher Leucippus, who is considered the founder of atomism. Almost no information about Leucippus has survived. Democritus believed that the primary principle of the world was not the single being of the Eleatics, but the multitude of atoms, Greek for indivisible, and the vacuum or void, depending on the translation, in which atoms moved eternally. By atom, he meant the smallest material particles, invisible to the naked eye, impenetrable, and indivisible. Curiously, for Democritus, the gods were also creations of nature, but more perfect than humans. Gods and all other bodies are composed of material atoms and do not interfere in the affairs of the world, he thought. Bodies move according to the mechanical laws of atom movement. These laws also form the basis of the material world and are not compatible with any religion that conceives of the existence of the transcendental, such as Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, Christianity, Judaism, etc. Furthermore, the materialist Democritus was a fierce opponent of religion or religions. He argued that neither worlds nor humans were created. He considered the human soul mortal, thus undermining Greek mythology. He played a considerable role in the further development of atheism. He denied the possibility of any miracle. He was an adversary of prophecies and spiritual phenomena, explaining the existence of religion as a result of human ignorance, their lack of knowledge of the laws of nature, and their fear of natural phenomena. This fact about Democritus is recognized in the philosophy compendiums of the Soviet Union. For this reason, Plato preached the divine origin of the world, the immortality of the soul, etc., and harbored fierce hatred against Democritus. Plato, some claim, seized Democritus' works and burned them. even refusing to mention the name of the philosopher he so hated in his works. I once saw a clip of de Burroughs making this comment: Epicurus materialismi Eleatic sect gave rise to the Epicurean sect. Epicurus, who lived between 342 and 270 BCE, established his philosophical school in Athens. When introduced to Democritus' philosophy, he became his fervent follower and successor, leaving a reasonable body of work of which only fragments and epistles have reached us. It is noteworthy that Hegel, the idealist, expressed satisfaction at the absence of the works of this Greek philosopher, known for his materialist perspective. For Epicurus, the world is made by chance and not by the execution of a design. Atoms move through all eternity. The earth is not a spherical body for him. It is a large disk held suspended in space by the atmosphere. The earth has no soul for Epicurus. It is by no means a divinity. Earthquakes should be attributed to underground exhalations, sudden shocks, and the encounter of certain opposing elements. For Epicurus, there are no senses after death. The soul is corporeal and experiences neither pain nor pleasure. Therefore, he states that heaven, hell, and the Elysian fields are fables stemming from false accounts and other superstitions. The philosophical conceptions of the materialist Epicurus are synthetically presented in the poem on the nature of things written by his successor, the Roman materialist philosopher Titus Lucretius Carus. While combating Plato's idealism, Epicurus defends Democritus' atomic theory. Like Democritus, he believes that the only objective reality is mobile material atoms and the void. In Epicurus' opinion, the collision of atoms occurs because they move obliquely, deviating from a straight line. Thus, they cause their concatenation and the formation of objects. The cause of this deviation, for Epicurus, is causality and the free will of the atom in its internal impulse. This thought of Epicurus, despite its somewhat idealist character, is positively appreciated by Marx and Engels. Lenin also appreciated Epicurus. For Epicurus, people fear death because they don't know what awaits them in the afterlife. But he states that there is no afterlife. A person's death means the decomposition of the atoms that constitute them, and consequently their total disappearance as well as that of their soul. For Marx, who studied materialists, considered him the greatest educator of antiquity, openly attacked religion, fought against the worship of gods, against spirituality, and explained the belief in gods as a consequence of human ignorance. This statement, moreover, is important to be interpreted from its epistemological and philosophical aspect. We should consider the epistemological developments of this position, not merely summarize it as an anti-theological position. Lucretius' materialism. Titus Lucretius Carus, an enthusiastic follower of Epicurus' philosophy in ancient Rome, lived between 99 and 55 BC. He articulated his philosophical concepts in the poem On the Nature of Things, and in his work, he continued the tradition of the Greek materialist. Furthermore, his atheism goes beyond, advocating for the total elimination of religion through the dissemination of information and discourses that undermine religious foundations. For Lucretius, the world has no relation to God, and in his doctrine, we find various dialectical conclusions. Lucretius' socio-political viewpoints stand out, in which he addresses the progressive evolution of social life historically. He describes the earliest stages of humanity, comparing them to a savage state, similar to animals. Human beings lived in forests and caves without clothes, unaware of fire, and consumed food in its natural state. Over many centuries, there was a cultural advance for Lucretius: the making of clothes from animal skins, the construction of houses, the use of fire, and the ability to work with metals emerged. Subsequently, human beings decided to unite in clans and tribes, creating small communities. The materialism of the sophists. We know the sophists were enemies of classical philosophers, skilled in the art of oratory. They were a school of thought in ancient Greece that focused on teaching rhetorical and argumentative skills to achieve success in public life, rather than specifically dedicating themselves to a philosophical investigation into the nature of the universe. Therefore, the sophist school is generally not framed within the materialist paradigm. Sophists, including Protagoras, were more concerned with rhetoric, argumentation, and the relativity of knowledge than with metaphysical questions related to the fundamental composition of reality. You might be asking, so why did you include this chapter, Paulo? I included it because it's curious how some Soviets saw sophists as good representatives and sources of inspiration. Protagoras of Abdera, for example, was classified as a materialist by some Marxist-Leninist historians and philosophers. He is best known for his statement, "Man is the measure of all things," which reflects an emphasis on relativism and subjectivity, aligning with Epicurean sensationalism. Protagoras argued that things are perceived differently by different individuals, and therefore there is no objective truth. In his critique of religion, he said, "I do not know whether God exists or not." Protagoras conceives the world in his own way. There can be no reliable knowledge of the world, he says. What may seem true to one person may seem false to another, he concludes. Here we see one of the seeds of modern relativism. The sophists confuse doxa opinion with veritas truth. We can read in the revisionist and propagandistic compendium of the history of philosophy elaborated by the Academy of Sciences of the Soviet Union, Institute of Philosophy, the following: the sophist school is of various shades, both in its political affiliation and in its philosophical conceptions. Among the early sophists, materialism predominates. Later ones slide into idealism. The very meaning of the word sophist changed historically with the change in the character of the sophist's activity. The sophists harshly criticized and ridiculed religious and mythological conceptions of the world, caste morality, which had become outdated, etc. In this, their merit is undoubtedly. Almost nothing of the sophists' works has been preserved. In the history of philosophy, sophists are divided into old and young. The greatest representatives of the old generation were Protagoras and Gorgias. Their philosophy is, in essence, materialist. It recognizes the existence of the material world, the mutability of matter, its fluidity. Each person, in Protagoras' view, conceives the world in their own way. There can be no reliable knowledge of the world. What may seem true to one may seem false to another. Gorgias, another representative of the old generation of sophists, approached subjective idealism and skepticism more than Protagoras. He denied the possibility of authentic and accurate knowledge of the world. He also doubted the objective existence of nature. His main work is called On the Non-Existent or On Nature. The sophists paid enormous attention to the problem of contradictions. But contrary to the Eleatics, they affirmed that contradictions were imaginary, illusory. The sophists demonstrated the contradictory nature of all phenomena in the world. It was in this way that they again raised the problem of dialectics. However, in most cases, the sophists reached subjective idealist conclusions, in their opinion. Any of two opposing conclusions could be perfectly demonstrated. Starting from this, they denied objective truth. In the same compendium, we read, Plato was a dangerous idealist. The theory of ideas, a further development of the Socratic theory of universals, of concepts, is the basis of Plato's philosophy. The sophist Thrasymachus, in the Platonic dialogues, argues that power creates right, meaning that justice is the imposition of the stronger. In this example, we already see what kind of morality, what kind of proposal the sophists are making. A relativistic morality. This idea converges with Marxist thought, incidentally, which conceives of law and morality as a creation of the bourgeois elites or as a result of economic dynamics. In Brazil, it's more or less like that. Justice served or not served favors those who can pay. Feuerbach's materialism. Titus Lucretius Carus, an enthusiastic follower of Epicurus philosophy in ancient Rome, lived between 99 and 55 BC. He articulated his philosophical concepts in the poem On the Nature of Things, and in his work, he continued the tradition of the Greek materialist Furthermore, his atheism goes beyond, advocating for the total elimination of religion through the dissemination of information and discourses that undermine religious foundations. For Lucretius, the world has no relation to God, and in his doctrine, we find various dialectical conclusions. Lucretius' socio-political viewpoints stand out, in which he addresses the progressive evolution of social life historically. He describes the earliest stages of humanity, comparing them to a savage state, similar to animals. Human beings lived in forests and caves without clothes, unaware of fire, and consumed food in its natural state. Over many centuries, there was a cultural advance for Lucretius, the making of clothes from animal skins, the construction of houses, the use of fire, and the ability to work with metals emerged. Subsequently, human beings decided to unite in clans and tribes, creating small communities. The materialism of the sophists. We know the sophists were enemies of classical philosophers, skilled in the art of oratory. They were a school of thought in ancient Greece that focused on teaching rhetorical and argumentative skills to achieve success in public life, rather than specifically dedicating themselves to a philosophical investigation into the nature of the universe. Therefore, the sophist school is generally not framed within the materialist paradigm. Sophists, including Protagoras, were more concerned with rhetoric, argumentation, and the relativity of knowledge than with metaphysical questions related to the fundamental composition of reality. You might be asking, so why did you include this chapter, Paulo? I included it because it's curious how some Soviets saw sophists as good representatives and sources of inspiration. Protagoras of Abdera, for example, was classified as a materialist by some Marxist-Leninist historians and philosophers. He is best known for his statement, "Man is the measure of all things," which reflects an emphasis on relativism and subjectivity, aligning with Epicurean sensationalism. Protagoras argued that things are perceived differently by different individuals, and therefore there is no objective truth. In his critique of religion, he said, "I do not know whether God exists or not." Protagoras conceives the world in his own way. There can be no reliable knowledge of the world, he says. What may seem true to one person may seem false to another, he concludes. Here we see one of the seeds of modern relativism. The sophists confused doxa opinion with veritas truth. We can read in the revisionist and propagandistic compendium of the history of philosophy elaborated by the Academy of Sciences of the Soviet Union, Institute of Philosophy, the following: the sophist school is of various shades, both in its political affiliation and in its philosophical conceptions. Among the early sophists, materialism predominates. Later ones slide into idealism. The very meaning of the word sophist changed historically with the change in the character of the sophists' activity. The sophists harshly criticized and ridiculed religious and mythological conceptions of the world, caste morality, which had become outdated, etc. In this, their merit is undoubtedly. Almost nothing of the sophists' works has been preserved. In the history of philosophy, sophists are divided into old and young. The greatest representatives of the old generation were Protagoras and Gorgias. Their philosophy is, in essence, materialist. It recognizes the existence of the material world, the mutability of matter, its fluidity. Each person, in Protagoras' view, conceives the world in their own way. There can be no reliable knowledge of the world. What may seem true to one may seem false to another. Gorgias, another representative of the old generation of sophists, approached subjective idealism and skepticism more than Protagoras. He denied the possibility of authentic and accurate knowledge of the world. He also doubted the objective existence of nature. His main work is called On the Non-Existent or On Nature. The sophists paid enormous attention to the problem of contradictions. But contrary to the Eleatics, they affirmed that contradictions were imaginary, illusory. The sophists demonstrated the contradictory nature of all phenomena in the world. It was in this way that they again raised the problem of dialectics. However, in most cases, the sophists reached subjective idealist conclusions, in their opinion. Any of two opposing conclusions could be perfectly demonstrated. Starting from this, they denied objective truth. In the same compendium we read, Plato was a dangerous idealist. The theory of ideas, a further development of the Socratic theory of universals, of concepts, is the basis of Plato's philosophy. The sophist Thrasymachus, in the Platonic dialogues, argues that power creates right, meaning that justice is the imposition of the stronger. In this example, we already see what kind of morality, what kind of proposal the sophists are making. A relativistic morality. This idea converges with Marxist thought, incidentally, which conceives of law and morality as a creation of the bourgeois elites or as a result of economic dynamics. In Brazil, it's more or less like that. Justice served or not served favors those who can pay. Feuerbach's materialism. Friedrich Engels wrote about Ludwig Feuerbach's materialism, elaborating his own ideas on this author's philosophy. Engels, in his work Ludwig Feuerbach and the End of Classical German Philosophy, critiques and develops concepts from Feuerbachian thought. Ludwig Feuerbach, like Ludwig and Karl Vogt, is a mechanistic materialist. Remember that Marxism is not a mechanistic materialism. We will return to this later. Feuerbach emphasized an empiricist and materialist approach to the investigation of nature and society. From this perspective, there is no room for metaphysical concepts such as soul, spirit, or divine entities. Instead, everything is reduced to matter and its observable manifestations. Mechanistic materialism is a philosophical current that holds that reality is composed exclusively of matter in motion, governed by mechanical natural laws. Materialism emerges as a central point in Engels' text, highlighting the conflict faced by the young Hegelians when confronting the practical necessities of their struggle against positive religion with Hegel's system. Engels states that the true importance of Hegel's philosophy lies in its revolutionary nature, as it challenges the idea of absolute and definitive truths. This is a very important point that we cannot forget about Marxism. According to Engels, Hegel relativizes truth, subjecting it to the historical process. He states that truth is not a collection of ready-made dogmatic propositions, but rather a continuous process of historical development. He argues that in both philosophical knowledge and historical practice, nothing is absolute or sacred. For Engels, Hegel's philosophy, by declaring its system as the realization of the absolute idea, ultimately stifles its revolutionary side. In the Hegelian system, nature is considered merely the externalization of the absolute idea, being subordinated to thought and the idea with a capital I. Its turning point occurs with Feuerbach's work The Essence of Christianity, which, according to the Marxist Engels, solves the problem by re-establishing materialism. Feuerbach places nature as independent of all philosophy, stating that it is the basis on which human beings, products of nature, develop. This is very important and is one of the roots of the problem. He rejects the existence of superior beings, considering them merely fantastic reflections of human beings. This materialist approach by Feuerbach is described as liberating by Engels, breaking the enchantment of the Hegelian system and resolving the contradiction that existed only in imagination. The text then introduces the great fundamental question of philosophy, the relationship between thinking and being in this context. Since ancient times, this question has been present in representations of the soul, its immortality, and the relationship between human thought and the external world. The question of the relationship between spirit and nature is central to philosophy. The philosophical division between idealism and materialism is presented as stemming from the answer to the fundamental question, whether God created the world or if the world has existed since eternity. This is not merely a theological question, but fundamentally a philosophical and cosmogonic one. For Engels, those who affirm the originality of the spirit form the field of idealism. He places people who defend the originality of the spirit in idealism, describing them as idealists, while those who see nature as original belong, according to him, to the various schools of materialism, as occurs in the Marxist position. Engels points out that progress in natural science and industry spurred philosophical development, influencing both materialists and idealists, and proposes that Marxism is an overcoming and an evolved form of past scientific conceptions of materialism. Even idealist systems were filled with materialist content, and Hegel's system is interpreted as an idealistically inverted materialism. Engels claims to break with Hegel's idealist system, perceiving the pre-mundane existence of the absolute idea, which he considers a fantasy, and that the material world is the only real one. Feuerbach concludes that matter is not a product of spirit, but spirit is the supreme product of matter. Engels writes, he cannot overcome the usual philosophical prejudice, the prejudice not against the thing, but against the name materialism. He says, materialism is for me the basis of the edifice of human being and knowledge, but for me, it is nothing of what it is for the physiologist, for the naturalist in the strict sense. Backward, I completely agree with the materialists, but not forward. Engels continues, the materialism of the last century was predominantly mechanical, because of all the natural sciences of that time, only mechanics, and, strictly speaking, only that of solid bodies, celestial and terrestrial, in short, the mechanics of gravity, had reached a certain completion. Chemistry existed only in its infantile form. Feuerbach does not seek to abolish religion but to perfect it. He argues that religion is essentially a relationship of feeling or heart between people, which historically manifests itself in different religious forms. Previously, this relationship sought its truth in fantastic representations of reality, such as divine images. But Feuerbach suggests that this truth can be found directly in the love between individuals. Thus, love between the I and the thou becomes, for Feuerbach, one of the highest, if not the highest, forms of practicing his new religion. Engels highlights the influence of materialism on post-Hegelian philosophy, especially in Marx's work. The break with Hegel's idealist philosophy implied a return to materialism, seeking to understand the real world without idealist foundations. The Hegelian dialectic, which conceived the development of the world as the self-development of the absolute concept, was rejected in favor of a materialist approach. This reduced dialectics to a play of universal laws of motion, both in the external world and in human thought, recognizing the interconnection between both. Materialism brought a dynamic view of the world as a complex of processes in constant change, breaking with the conception of stable and ready-made things that we see in Parmenides, for example. That is, it is a type of Heraclitean materialism in which Engels proposes to abandon the rules of metaphysics, proposing that truths are relative and subject to change according to circumstances and the development of knowledge, metaphysics, and idealism, for them, are the same thing, which is clearly mistaken. This point is in part 4 of Engels' text, which is very illuminating as he embraces relativism and boasts about it, arguing that it is an advance. He attacks notions of semantic fixation of the absolute and affirms a revolutionary character. In Hegel. In philosophical terms, we can say that he claims there is a contradiction between Heraclitus and Parmenides, that is, the metaphysics of becoming and the metaphysics of being. He chooses Heraclitus, obviously, taking it to its ultimate consequences within epistemology, and says that this is an overcoming of this supposed contradiction. Engels puts it this way. He's essentially a clown. I remember saying in college that Marxism is a philosophy based on relativism. This reminds me of those days. I remember some colleagues looking at me with an arrogant and superior air, as if I were saying something simplistically foolish. Well, here is Engels' text. We again grasp the concepts in our heads materialistically, as images of real things, instead of grasping real things as images of this or that stage of the absolute concept. With this, dialectics was reduced to the science of the universal laws of motion, both of the external world and of human thought. Two series of laws which are substantially identical, but which are diverse in expression, insofar as the human mind can apply them consciously, while in nature, and so far also largely in human history, they make their way unconsciously in the form of external necessity, amidst an endless series of apparent causalities. But with this, the dialectic of the concept itself became merely a conscious reflection of the dialectical movement of the real world. And with this, Hegel's dialectic was turned on its head. The demand for definitive solutions and eternal truths comes to an end once and for all. One is always conscious of the necessary limitation of all acquired knowledge, of its conditioning by the circumstances in which it was acquired, but one also no longer allows the unconquerable oppositions of the old metaphysics still and always in vogue between true and false, good and bad, identical and diverse, necessary and accidental to impose themselves. One knows that these oppositions have only relative validity, that what is now known as true also has its hidden false side, which will appear later, just as what is now known as false has its true side, by virtue of which it could previously have been considered true. One knows that what is affirmed as necessary is composed of clear causalities, and that the supposedly accidental is the form behind which necessity hides. I find this metaphor curious because Marxism does indeed see the world upside down. It's striking that he also writes dialectics was reduced to the science of the universal laws of motion. That is, he converges the verb reduced with the word universals. This is the guy who claims to have overcome metaphysics. Trust him. Marx's doctoral thesis. The conclusion of your provided text is a thèse tutorial de Marx, which indicates a shift to discussing Marx's doctoral thesis. Marx's doctoral thesis. Marx's thesis on Epicurus is a starting point for Marxist materialism, or at least one of them. In the 17th century, Epicurus's ideas were propagated through figures like Gassendi and Bernier. Marx found in Gassendi's work, stripped of later interpretations, a springboard for French materialism. We should also recall that atomism significantly influenced English philosophy in the 17th and 18th centuries, particularly the materialist and nominalist thought of Hobbes. Marx's doctoral research led him to examine the prevalent philosophies of his time, identifying three central positions: Democritus's mechanistic materialism, Hegel's system, and the philosophy of self-consciousness as represented by Epicurus and the young Hegelians. Marx favored the freedom of man found in Epicurus's philosophy, contrasting it with Democritus's mechanistic determinism. He utilized Epicurus's sensationalism as a departure point for his materialism, opposing Hegel's absolute idealism and finding common ground with English empiricism. Bacon, Thomas Hobbes's materialist philosophy, and Pierre Gassendi's French materialism, ancient atomism, championed by Leucippus and Democritus, emerged as a response to Parmenides' Eleatic challenge, maintaining a sensationalist approach. For Marx, the shift in perspective initiated by Epicurus, especially regarding atomism, was crucial for Marxian materialism. Marx went beyond Epicurus by seeking to understand the relationships between humans and the world with the aim of transforming it through action. This materialism, evident in his mature works, differs from both ancient atomistic philosophy and Feuerbachian materialism. Marx criticized earlier materialists, including Feuerbach, for passively conceiving of objects and reality without considering human activity as practical and objective. He proposed practical critical activity in understanding and transforming the world. Marx's doctoral thesis, titled Difference Between the Democritian and Epicurean Philosophy of Nature, was conceived in 1839 and completed in 1841 when Marx was just 23. Originally divided into two parts, it addressed the general and specific differences between the philosophies of nature of these two Greek thinkers. Some of the text has been lost over time. As we know, Marx hoped to obtain his doctorate in philosophy from the University of Jena and an academic position at the University of Bonn, where he also planned to expand his research into a history of Hellenistic philosophy. However, his plans were thwarted due to the rise of Wilhelm II power in Prussia and the political persecution of the left Hegelians. He ended up as editor of the Rheinische Zeitung in Cologne. Despite the doctoral thesis representing a limited academic project, Marx aspired to a broader historical philosophical critique, extolling the atomist school as the pinnacle of this history. In his preface, Marx declared his research to be innovative, highlighting the lack of preparatory works on the subject of his thesis. He paved the way for diverse research, from the pre-Socratic to the Hellenistic period, including the skeptic, Stoic, and Cynic schools. Although his originality is questioned, especially in relation to Democritus's and Epicurus's philosophies of nature, he made several mentions of Hegel throughout his thesis research, indicating his objective to develop a philosophy of history. And a history of philosophy.it was against the Hegelian conception of philosophy and the history of philosophy, and above all against the contempt Hegel showed for Epicurus's philosophy, that Marx reacted by writing his thesis. Therefore, unlike Hegel, for whom the history of philosophy unfolded under the banner of idealism, Marx developed a materialist perspective of the history of philosophy and saw the Epicurean system as a positive model for this materialism. Karl. Marx briefly analyzed the philosophical views of the ancients regarding Democritus's and Epicurus's physics, noting a negative bias against Epicurus. He sought to dismantle these views to place Epicurus in a higher position within the ancient tradition in the eyes of philosophical modernity. The primary goal was to present ancient sources and cross-reference their opinions on the physics of both philosophers. According to Marx, Democritus is characterized as a skeptic who interprets sensory reality as a mere subjective appearance, believing that only atoms and the void are the true principles of all reality. He is described as a cultivated man who traveled the world, acquiring knowledge in various fields, which led to his dissatisfaction with philosophical knowledge and a search for broader, more objective understanding. On the other hand, Epicurus is presented as a dogmatist who considers the sensible world to be an objective manifestation. He values the senses as arbiters of truth, rejecting the idea that sensations like sweet, bitter, hot, and cold are mere conventions. Epicurus emphasizes the importance of the senses as absolute sources of knowledge, reinforcing what we said earlier, and seeks to provide spiritual satisfaction and a life of tranquility, in contrast to Democritus's pursuit of scientific knowledge. Epicurus, by taking sensibility as the main criterion, can be considered a relativist thinker. According to Marx, Epicurus refutes Democritus on the formation of composite bodies and reflects on questions about atoms. Historical materialism and its foundations. Karl Marx's materialism is widely accepted among Marxists, and the German ideology marked the emergence of historical materialism, a theory and methodology associated with the names of Marx and Engels. There is an epistemological break that separates the pre-Marxist phase from the original thought of Marx and Engels, the truly Marxist phase in which they developed their original theory, the so-called original theory. When Marx and Engels wrote the manuscript of the German ideology between 1845 and 1846, they were in a period of intellectual transition and collaboration where they developed the ideas and methods that would form the basis of historical materialism. To delve into the dialectic of Marxist materialism, it is crucial to examine the pillars of historical materialism. In his youth, Marx was influenced by Hegel's ideas, as we know, but after the philosopher's death, his disciples diverged in two different currents. Marx integrated himself into the left Hegelian movement, yet he gradually constructed his own doctrine based on the principles of socialism. To understand Marx, it is crucial to recognize him as an anti-idealist thinker. He opposed the idealist view of history, which considered ideas as the driving force of society. For Marx, the basis of history was material, that is, the social and economic relations between individuals defined its foundation. Historical materialism proposes that human history is driven by conflicts between social classes. Classes are defined by their relationship to the means of production, and the dominant class exploits the dominated class to maintain its power. Dialectical materialism is the analytical tool used by Marxists to understand this dynamic of history. It is based on the idea that reality is in constant transformation through a process of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, according to Ferreira dos Santos. In his critique of idealism, Marx's position is diametrically opposed to the canon that affirms the priority of spirit over matter. to accept the priority of matter over spirit. Marx's entire struggle, and this should be particularly noted, is a struggle against idealism and not against spiritualism. The metaphysics he fought against is idealist metaphysics. Subsequently, among the followers of Marxism, we always find the confusion between subjective idealist metaphysics and metaphysics in general. Marx was not interested in solving the great problems of metaphysics, but rather in studying the great laws of human evolution, the laws of history, to the idealism of the right-wing Hegelians, which he judged as Hegel's, asserting that ideas directed the world. He opposed the economic conditions that condition those ideas. These constitute the essential structure of human relations, and upon them, ideologies form the superstructure. This, at least, is Marx's doctrine in the truly Marxist phase. As Engels rightly said, philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. This emphasis is brought strongly by Marxist philosophers, this intention to transform the world. Such words express more clearly than others the meaning of the historical materialist doctrine, which, wishing to be scientific, aspires to what science aspires to, action. Marxism is not a contemplative or purely speculative philosophy, but a philosophy of action. Marxism, as the theory and practice of revolution, is the theory of the proletariat class. In this sense, it is theoretical, partial, and partisan. It is very convenient that it attributes partisanship to everything, because this justifies its practice. Despite Engels having stated that thought and consciousness are a product of the human brain, Marxists take all precautions not to be confused with mechanistic materialists such as Feuerbach and Vogt, and they defend the conception of dialectical materialism, which above all affirms the priority of matter over spirit. Mechanistic materialism is a philosophical current that holds that reality is composed exclusively of matter in motion, governed by mechanical natural laws. This approach emphasizes the physical and objective nature of the world, denying the existence of any supernatural entity or force. Mechanistic materialists believe that all phenomena can be explained through the analysis of interactions between material elements and their physical properties. It is important to understand that mechanistic materialism is not the same materialism advocated by Karl Marx, but a piece within it. Marx's materialism, conceived as historical materialism, incorporates elements of dialectical materialism, which is a philosophical theory that emphasizes the interconnectedness and interdependence of processes and phenomena in nature and society. Marx did not focus solely on a purely mechanistic view of reality, but also considered historical, social, and economic factors in his analysis. In historical materialism, Marx argues that the material and economic conditions of a society are fundamental to understanding its social, political, and cultural organization. He emphasizes the role of relations of production and productive forces in determining social and historical development. For Marxists, the material world exists independently of all spirit, and it is in matter as such that thesis, antithesis, and synthesis will be realized, which are provisional and mark the starting points for new theses and antitheses. In short, Marx criticizes Feuerbach for his contemplative materialism, which is limited to mere contemplation and sensation of the sensible world without considering its historical and social nature. He sees the sensible world as something static and eternal, ignoring that it is the product of human activity throughout history. All philosophical problems, including the relationship of man to nature, are solved by recognizing that the unity of man with nature has existed in industry, varying according to historical development. Feuerbach does not perceive, according to Marx, that the science of nature is also dependent on human activity, industry, and commerce, which in a way is correct. According to Marx, if this activity were interrupted, the natural world would undergo significant changes, and Feuerbach would soon realize his own lack of existence. The materialist dictator experiment. Let's do a thought experiment. Suppose I have a materialist brother who is a country leader and a sociopath. He woke up this morning and decided to enslave 30% of men and women and eliminate 20% of the remaining population to, in Paulo Freire's words, prevent life. But he won't do this if someone can prove to him through arguments that it's inappropriate, that is, purely through rational argumentation. However, there's a catch. The only philosophy allowed for this argument is materialist philosophy, excluding merely atomistic philosophies. By materialism here, we understand what Marxists understand. In philosophy, materialism refers to the doctrine that there is no substance other than matter. This is a monist position that denies the metaphysical, spiritual, and mental dimensions. Denial is the crucial word here that cannot be overlooked. Materialism also denies the idea of a soul and only recognizes the existence of material substances. In this way, you might conclude that right and wrong are historical, social, and cultural conventions, but not transcendent entities, divine notions, or ontologically existing metaphysical objects, just as a Marxist would. So, what argument would you provide to my brother to convince him not to prevent people's lives and not to enslave 30% plus 20% of the population, which would likely include you? Perhaps you would say it's against the law or that it's wrong. My brother is, shall we say, a positivist, which doesn't contradict materialism. He himself has approved a law establishing him as dictator of Brazil, and he has decreed that his immediate desires, including unwritten thoughts and projects, are the law itself. Well, what would you do and argue now? Perhaps you'd say it's wrong, but wrong and right are metaphysical notions, notions that fall within axiology, or at least when they serve as criteria for choice. Such notions have metaphysical roots, embedded in the axiological dimension. This is inescapable. Let's elaborate on this idea. There are two conceptions of right and wrong. Number one, the materialist one, which considers right and wrong as objective values produced by matter, by humans in a social, cultural, and historical context. Number two, the one that conceives the existence of universals, of entities of reason, of positive ontological existence, and which therefore conceives right and wrong with an immutable ontological essence. Remember that Marx proposes the opposite of the immutable. In this second conception, right and wrong are grounded in a transcendental logos. In our experiment, due to its rules, the only argument you can use in this sense is the materialist right and wrong, of course, as subjective values produced by matter, by humans in a social, cultural, and historical context. In this way, the argument is not effective. If you use this argument that it's wrong, my fictional brother will tell you that what is right for you, the arguer, is wrong for him. Therefore, for him, it will be right to bring harm to the population. Some time ago, I saw a scientific article on Phil Papers. I don't remember the title, unfortunately, but if I do, I'll include it in the references, in which an Anglophone philosopher defended the value of human life in a materialist way. The idea was ingenious, but ultimately funny and amusing. It stated that the value of human life lay in its potentiality, that the potentiality of human learning was infinite, and that in this way, because humans possess more potential than animals. For example, we are worth more than animals. To cite an example he gave, one of his academic colleagues promptly refuted the nonsense, using the argument from transhumanists that computers would surpass human potentiality in a few decades, if they haven't already with quantum computers. According to this proposal, computers would be worth more than humans, and before the end of this century, we should prioritize the lives of computers over humans. This is nonsense and ultimately fails to achieve his paper's objective of defending the dignity and value of human life. We could even add the notion of potentiality and the quantitative hierarchy of these potentialities as value. So what are we talking about here? Why should we accept this hierarchy as something right? See, again, we return two notions that are metaphysical. In materialism, any hierarchy is not justified unless its value and existence can be materially justified, which is impossible. I remember in college how my communist colleagues literally laughed at the notion of hierarchy and made strange faces as if it were an alien, as if it were childish nonsense, an idiocy, evidently Marxist mockery. But why did I say earlier that? The attempt of the philosopher with a funny and amusing. Well, because it's obvious that it's absolutely impossible to defend the value of human life starting from a materialist philosophy. Of course, no one will be able to offer an argument for our materialist dictator experiment by presenting materialist arguments. And mind you, the status questionus of this problem is well developed and full of previously failed attempts elaborated with the greatest rigor that analytical philosophy can offer. Here lies the great problem of communism and Marxism. They are materialists, and as such, there are no metaphysical absolutes for them. That is why they will never accept the dozens of criticisms made against them. That is why they are murderers or support murderers when they take complete power, for there is no absolute value of human life for them. There is no truth, charity, honesty, beauty, justice, hierarchy, or honesty. These objects are metaphysical for materialists. They are mere social, historical, and cultural conventions at the whim of the revolution itself. They are petty bourgeois whims or alienating fantasies created by elites or economic interests. Marxist materialism, a pseudoscience, it's curious, but this epistemological limitation imposed by the adoption of materialism is the closest Marxism has gotten to science. Note that if we change the criterion for arguments in the materialist dictator experiment to allow everyone to use science to convince my brother, nothing would change. It would be even funnier to imagine someone looking with the Hubble telescope for a code for the value of human life in Saturn's rings or using genetic mapping to find such a code. Perhaps a subatomic particle collider. Maybe a microscope to analyze human cells. Surely the code will be there, right? Well, that's not how it is. Of course, I really like science. It's incredible, and its fruits, when produced seriously, are very beneficial, interesting, and productive. But science does not have the capacity to address metaphysical objects such as axiological and justice issues, for example. Scientism is a trap precisely for this reason, and Marx, who called the socialists before him utopian and tried to create a scientific socialism, the closest he got to science was in this regard, importing a limitation from it and the other element, which is the attempt to take action. Only these two elements, but it lacks predictive capacity, which is very important in science. It's not falsifiable, it's not knowable. Let's be honest, the number of interpretations you have of hidden passages, not from one but from several. Marxists makes Marxist work unknowable, speaking of knowability here as one of the criteria for something to be scientific. Well, anyway, let's not get into that topic or the video will get too long. The problem of moral value materialism is a serious problem in Marxism and communism. This becomes more explicit when we understand the problem of moral value. The question of moral value is at the heart of ethics, which analyzes whether this value is intrinsic or extrinsic. In other words, we must analyze the question of value in Marxist judgments about the proletariat and the bourgeois. Why is it considered good and desirable by Marxists to say that the bourgeois stink, are thieves, and should be killed and dispossessed of their property, but obtaining profit and the right to private property are wrong and evil from their perspective? Why does relativism not apply to them in this case, since they benefit from profit? Paraphrasing Condorcet to you, yes, to me, no, why? Suppose you were confronted with a proposed list of intrinsic goods formulated by Marxist theory. It would be natural to ask how you could assess the accuracy of the list of goods with good moral value and other bad ones. I will provide a list shortly. How do we know if this value is valid? How do we know if it is good and just, since many followers of Marxism believe that this is a just system or seeks justice? Marxist propaganda heavily emphasizes that Marxism is just and charitable on some level. This is a fundamental epistemological question to determine whether the system itself is good or bad. This question connects to the work of Karl Menger. For example, who postulates that the value of a product is not in itself, that is, he is saying that value is not intrinsic, but rather in the mind of the person who wants to acquire it. In other words, Menger's theory, from a philosophical approach, could be said to affirm the extrinsic value of products in a market dynamic. That is, value is not intrinsic or anchored in labor time or in aggregated products. Let's advance the question a bit by presenting the conclusion. Menger's theory applies not only to economics but to everything. All value of something that exists is totally extrinsic, or rather outside of it. There is only one intrinsic value, which is value itself as the source of all other values. And this is only if you are a theist. But if you are not forget it. Then for you, nothing will exist that possesses a purely intrinsic value. Well, let's say that the intrinsic value of something is the value that the thing has in itself or by its own right. Extrinsic value, on the other hand, is the value derived from something external to the object. Let's get to the point of communist actions, which is what interests us here, as well as Marxist actions. The fact that an action is morally right or wrong has exclusively to do with whether its consequences are extrinsically or intrinsically better than previous ones, or better than any other action that can be performed in the circumstances. Furthermore, moral responsibility depends on the functions of right and wrong in relation to the action of a subject who is capable of identifying the moral value of actions, objects, and phenomena. The question of intrinsic or extrinsic value is also pertinent for judgments about moral justice, whether related to moral rights or moral desert, insofar as it is good for justice to be done and bad for justice to be denied in ways that seem intimately linked to intrinsic value. Note that the idea of social justice, therefore, needs to consider these issues. Note also that this is universal. When we put ourselves in the position of a victim, if I or you are a victim, we will always consider it good to obtain justice, whether you are a judge, a professor, a policeman, a Marxist, a member of a criminal faction, or the worst scoundrel that exists. If you are vulnerable, you will always consider that doing justice for you is a good thing, and in this, no one is a relative street.to. Better clarify this issue in the terms we are adopting now. Consider the following. Typically, Christians judge virtue as something whose value is intrinsically good and moral vices as something intrinsically evil. So, would capitalism be intrinsically evil? Would the noble savage be intrinsically good? Are the boss, profit, usury, and private property intrinsically evil? And if so, why? And if not, when are they extrinsically evil? Let me venture a guess. If private property, profit, and usury belong to Marxists, then they are good. Is that it? Because they serve the revolution, then they are considered and evaluated as good by Marxists, or at least they are said to serve the masses in propaganda. And if, on the other hand, property and profit belong to the enemies of the party, then they are evil. Is this the answer we get? This is the relativist answer. Moral valuation is completely arbitrary. This valuation is relativistic, sophistical, and more than that. If so or if not, what are the consequences in society of adopting one or another form of valuation? This is another very important point. In his dialogue with Protagoras, Plato, the idealist enemy of the Soviet authors of Leninist compendiums, states, when people condemn pleasure, they do so not because they take pleasure in being bad as such, but because of the bad consequences. For example, at one point Socrates says that the only reason why the unrestrained pleasures of food and drink seem to be bad is that they result in pain and deprive us of future pleasures. In the immanent dimension, value is derived from two things: its practical consequences and its valuation by an external subject. This external subject can be me, it can be you. This subject can also be God if you are a theist. The derivation of value. Suppose someone asked you if it is good to help a worker in need. Unless you suspect some kind of trick, you would answer, yes, of course. If that person then asked you why it is good to act that way, you might say that it is good to help others in need simply because it is good that their needs are met. If they then asked you why it is good for people to have their needs met, you would then be confused, right? Rephrasing the question for you, as philosophy often does, you might be inclined to simply say, it just is, which is probably how almost all Marxists would respond that profit is wrong and the bourgeoisie is evil, simply because it is. Or you could accept the legitimacy of the question and say that people's needs should be met because it brings them pleasure, for example, or even say that profit upsets Marxists and makes people emotionally fragile. But then, of course, your interlocutor could ask once more, as we love to do in philosophy, what is good about that? Perhaps at this point you would respond, it's simply good that Marxists are satisfied and that those helped in the first example are also satisfied. Or it's good because it's more just, I don't know, and thus you would end this line of questioning. Or perhaps you would again try to explain the fact that it is good for people to be satisfied in terms of something else that you consider good. In reality, this is based on guesswork and on the appearance that Marxism places on things. But look, from the point of view of serious argumentation, at some point you will have to put an end to the questions. We cannot continue this derivation indefinitely, so you don't end things because you get tired of them, but because you would be forced to recognize that if one thing derives its good from another thing, that still derives its good from a third thing, and then a fourth, and so on. There must come a point where you reach something whose good is not derived from anything, but is simply good in itself, that is, intrinsically good. We are talking here about the source of good, this first good. We will call the logos. It possesses only an intrinsic value and is the source of all other derivations of good. Note that this logos, this first good, is an absolute. It is not relative. It is fixed, and it fixes the value of other derivations, whether in a Christian way through a God or in a Platonic way as a source of the world of ideas. This is the intrinsically good and not derivatively good. The logos is good in itself. Christian metaphysics and Marxist morality. According to Marx in his doctoral thesis, Clement of Alexandria attributes the Apostle Paul's criticism to Epicurean philosophy. This criticism can be observed in his first epistle to the Corinthians, chapter 15, verses 32-34. In these verses, Paul makes an indirect reference to Epicureans, to Epicurean philosophers, when speaking about those who affirm, "Let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die," a phrase often associated with Epicurus's hedonistic and materialist philosophy. Already in the time of the Apostle Paul, Epicureanism preached the pursuit of pleasure and tranquility as the main goal of life, advocating a materialist view and a conception that death was the absolute end of existence. However, for Paul, this hedonistic and materialist view conflicted with his own Christian message, which emphasized spiritual values and the afterlife. An interesting point lies in Christian metaphysics, which delineates this issue and helps us understand it a little better. We place them side by side and gain a clearer understanding of what Marxism is doing and what it is not doing. So I am using Christian metaphysics here as a counterpoint. In Christian metaphysics, there is no object, action, or phenomenon that is intrinsically evil. A given object is evil only extrinsically, and it is evil because there is an absence of good in that object. This is the Christian conception. The stance that believes there is intrinsic evil in objects is called Gnosticism, in which the malevolent logos is called the demiurge, the evil god. In Marxism, contrary to the first position, we see an implicit conception of intrinsic evil in things, similar to gnosis. This intrinsic evil rests in society and its systems, in the capitalist system, in religion, in profit, in usury, in more modern theories, in patriarchy, etc. The intrinsic moral value of these elements is also situational, being valued extrinsically, as well as an obvious consequence of the application of historical materialism, which will conceive profit as good as a momentary tool for the revolution, but in a broad, meta-historical and general sense. It is considered intrinsically evil in Marx.so. Here I am not saying that intrinsic evil exists, but when you study Marxism, you realize that implicitly there is an epistemological affirmation of an intrinsic evil. There is an affirmation that if you consistently derive those premises, you can only sustain them through the conception of a malevolent logos, of something that is intrinsically evil. Capitalism is intrinsically evil. Patriarchy is intrinsically evil. Idealist conceptions are treated as intrinsically evil. Epistemological and philosophical conceptions that postulate Parmenides' metaphysics of being are considered evil. Well, we know that in the cosmogonic field, Marxism is a monist doctrine, as it is
É o nosso
based only
raciocínio
on a
sobre isso.
primordial substance, which is matter. But in the moral field, it is a type of dualism. If you are meditating on these axiological questions right now, you must be realizing that Marxism implicitly leads to an atheistic axiological dualism, in which we could metaphorically say that Democritus' atomized demons are personified in abstract entities such as capitalism, the bourgeois society, profit, the metaphysics of being, idealism, patriarchy, etc. Thus, there is always a dualistic moral logic, sometimes vulgarly Manichaean, in Marxism. For example, proletariat versus bourgeois, worker versus capitalist, student versus teacher, criminal versus policeman, politician versus businessman, public servant versus politician, trade unionist versus employer, guerrilla versus reactionary, irrational animals versus humans, environment versus humans, women versus men, gays versus straights, and so on. Note that in Marxism, an oppressed person in a dialectical relationship with an oppressor often becomes an oppressor in another dialectical relationship. I would bet that in the coming years, for example, we will see Marxist theories taken seriously asserting that machines and artificial intelligence need emancipation from humans and that we humans oppress them. Certainly, others will still have this logic, asserting that it is machines under the possession of big businessmen that oppress humans, thus proposing human emancipation from these machines. As we see, for example, Soviet philosophers revealing that they take Plato as their ideological enemy, as well as Socrates, who, according to them, plotted against the state and practically deserved his death. On the other hand, the Brazilian Marxist translator Edson Bini, in the Edipro edition, claims that Plato was a communist and that Socrates' disciple proposed communism through the figure of the philosopher king, the complete opposite. Here again, it is noted that truth and facts are historically relative to the whim of the party, to propaganda, relative to the convenience of the moment, just as it was with the positivists, just as it is with relative, dynamic, materialist morality. This is more than a moral and extrinsic problem. Returning to the question of derivations, let's illustrate this. For example, helping a worker can have the derived good of certain pleasant experiences induced in those who receive help. Suppose the question is rephrased about the reason for the response. Then we could say that the derived good of certain good experiences is good because they are pleasant and produce pleasure. Again, we would explain the third derivation of good based on the presence of pleasure in the human sensory apparatus, which is capable of intuiting pleasure and pain. Again, this good is in the good organization of the senses, that is, it is in the intellect, it is external, extrinsic, and it is in the human organism, and so on, deriving the good until it reaches the first good, which is the logos, whose value is purely intrinsic, which is the source of other values. This leads us to a truth. All intrinsic value possesses a foundational logos. All extrinsic value also possesses a foundational logos. Now, if there is a moral evil that is an intrinsic value, then there must necessarily also be a logos for the intrinsic existence of evil. In this way, we fall into an epistemological moral dualism in which there is an evil God, a demiurge, who is the original source of intrinsic evil in the world. According to this perspective, this God will be the origin of the intrinsic evil of capital, of society, of profit. Note that Marxism has fallen into a very serious aporia. Let's rephrase. Perhaps we should call this logos of intrinsic evil mammon, as Marx himself does in the second part of his text on the Jewish question. In his anti-Semitic text titled On the Jewish Question, in which he compares Jews to the demon mammon, Marx used the name of the demon mammon in a pejorative way, obviously, because in rabbinical writings, mammon means both money in a restricted sense and greed, avarice, possessions in a broad sense. These possessions are everything that has a price or everything that a human being possesses beyond their body and life. But if Marxism affirms the moral existence of mammon and denies this cosmogonic existence through materialism, how can one or the other be correct at the same time? The answer, I imagine Marxists incapable of dreaming of resolving any infant teleporia or an epistemological or metaphysical problem would be, that's a dialectical question. Taking dialectic in the sense of contradiction, making the confusion that Ferreira dos Santos points out that Marxists make the terms contradiction, dialectic, and opposition are confusing in Marxism and generate several problems. Elaborating a hypothetical list and its problems. Let's try to elaborate a list as we would have it according to the Marxist and communist view without getting into the merits of the question. We can even apparently agree with some items on the list, even disagreeing with the means to achieve them. The question is not that. It is of a moral order. Well, a hypothetical list would be intrinsically evil side, profit, usury, capitalism, bourgeois, class division, economic exploitation, big capitalists, surplus value, commodification, economic crises, imperialism, and so on, intrinsically. Good side, proletariat, class consciousness, social and class equality, revolution, economic planning, union and trade unionist, social regulation or social engineering, dictatorship of the proletariat, financial emancipation, decolonization, empowerment, etc. Regardless of whether this list would be exactly like this or almost like this, the question is, why? Why is one list evil and the other good? Why are the elements of the other valued as good, as morally good, intrinsically good? The answer may seem obvious to the most inattentive, as if we were asking why killing is evil. However, most of us would not say that a tiger killing a gazelle in sub-Saharan Africa is evil. Killing insects, birds, and others is also not seen as evil by almost all people. It is likely that all hungry people on an island killing fish to survive would not say that this is evil. There also tend to be a significant number of people who see no problem with this type of execution. In this case, the context and the purpose of killing become important criteria for this evaluation. So realize that the question is not as simple and obvious as it seems to the naive. Well, regarding the answer to the list, let's exclude the idiotic answers because I want to. This is an alienating inquiry for the benefit of big capital, reactionary and retrograde, bourgeois, right-wing, and other adjectives that evade the question of because Marx, Engels, and other Marxists so defined it, or I don't think so. This question doesn't matter. The underlying point is that those who value for its own sake what is intrinsically evil thus demonstrate a kind of moral sensibility allied with a political attitude for the destruction of this supposed evil. We observe that all this revolves around a question of axiological value, that is, of moral value, of subjective value, of monetary value, of societal value. Through this table, we perceive a presumption of the existence of intrinsic value, both evil and good, in both lists. Intrinsic value requires the considerations that it is necessarily true that everything that is intrinsically good is such that it is appropriate to value it for its own sake, and that its value is in itself. That is why it is intrinsic. That is why we are saying it is intrinsic. B. It is necessarily true that everything that is appropriate to value for its own sake is intrinsically valuable. But who said that intrinsic values exist to begin with? Pure intrinsic values in the temporal dimension. All intrinsic value is also partially extrinsic, with the exception of the foundational logos. Pure intrinsic values do not exist in the product, as in labor value. Pure intrinsic values do not exist beyond their mere conception as an entity of reason. Furthermore, the concept of intrinsic value is inapplicable insofar as, even if something in the temporal dimension had such value, we could not know it. And therefore the fact of having such value could not play any role in our reasoning about it. Since they do not exist beyond the conception of an entity of reason, there is no deriving a malignant or benign value from the items on the hypothetical list we created, and the entire communist struggle becomes illusory and amorally hollow. Deception. Imagine that a demon wishes you to value him for his own sake and threatens to cause you severe suffering unless you do so. It seems that you have good reasons to do what he wants. Is it appropriate or adequate to meet his demand and value him for his own sake, even if he is clearly not intrinsically good? Or should we say that it is good to obey the demon so that he does not harm us? This thought experiment leads us to a curious aporia that we see in reality with communism. For example, the Chinese state forces companies to teach Chinese communism as something good to children at the risk of harming them if they do not. We reflect on why the boss supposedly exploits the proletariat, obtaining profit from their work. Is something wrong or evil? It may seem obvious to the most inattentive, but the question is neither obvious nor simple, as we have already argued here. Here we perceive that implicitly there is a moral consideration in Marxism, a supposed evil. Problem in capitalist society. Let's add something to the question to make its problem even more explicit. Why is the boss supposedly exploiting labor by obtaining profit from his work something evil, while sending bourgeois to forced labor camps and assassinating high class? People supposedly guilty of being heirs or obtaining large property, putting into practice a guerrilla manual like Marighell's. How can this be something good and desirable? And what's more, what the boss is supposedly taking from the proletariat is not just part of their liquid private property or their purchasing power of private property, and private property is not in itself something intrinsically evil. If private property should not exist when one person takes part of another's private property, who should have nothing, why is that something evil? What is worse, having part of one's liquid private property taken away or assassinating those who supposedly reduced it? Which action is evil and which action is good in itself for its own sake? The definition of evil and good there is arbitrary, you see, or it follows an illogical ethical rule of Marxist illogic. Let's still ask, does logic exist as something good, or is it just a subterfuge of the bourgeois elites? Which action is evil? Which action is good? We ask. Two types of answers can be given in this context. The first is the pragmatic answer. It is good and evil because it causes harm in some way and benefit in another. However, the pragmatic answer can only be observed and validated by the practical result in reality, and as we see, this does not manifest. The world's great billionaires and many millionaires and other wealthy people are in fact socialists or progressives, and communism and Marxism in practice reveal themselves to be tireless killing machines whose advocates openly proscribe armed struggle, which obviously implies murder and genocide. This is obvious. But even if socialism and progressivism harm the bourgeois, capitalists, and elitists, why do they adopt this ideology? As we see, absolutely all, without the slightest exception, all countries that adopt socialism, communism, and progressivism degenerate in all areas, with the difference in the speed of decadence. Therefore, the pragmatic answer does not corroborate the moral question. The truth is that Marxism is an ideology made to destroy empires, and if it destroys even empires and imperialisms, what does it not do to poor countries? The answer, because it harms you, requires proof, and we know that receiving nothing is worse than receiving something, in the case of the proletariat, even if it is supposed crumbs. Furthermore, the very idea of unstoppable progress and civilizational advancement that is in the background of Marxism is incompatible with the idea of class consciousness that never comes, but that the supposed alienation only increases. If we think by analogy, in reality, we are all connected in society. When the elites become poor, all of society becomes poor. When the poor flee or die, the elites also suffer. The classes are not in struggle or conflict, but are part of a social whole, a single social organism. And just as piercing a person's kidney affects their entire body, destroying a group within society means destroying oneself in a somewhat slower process. Our arm is not in conflict of struggle with our legs, just as the Indian castes, which are representations of a divine body, the body of Brahma, are not in conflict. Now, more precisely, on the individual level, we see that it is businessmen who are in conflict with each other, businessmen in conflict with other businessmen, in competition with them. In short, regarding the pragmatic reflection, we realize that the results of Marxist policies are dialectical, that is, they affirm an apparent thesis of emancipation and the end of human alienation and exploitation, but in practice they always result in their antithesis, that is, in more alienation, more exploitation, more poverty, more death. They always worsen the situation. Finally, they generate a synthesis in which Marxists reinterpret their theses, turning them upside down, penetrating other fields, instrumentalizing and transforming everything into politics to return to the thesis, failing again in a new antithesis, apparently in an endless cycle of failures. Materialism and the problem in concepts. Another problem arising from the adoption of materialism is the absence of a logos for semantic support. Semantics within materialism become relative, since materialism is a type of monism where the only existing substance is matter, and matter is temporal, relative, heterogeneous, and inconstant. Then conceptions, truth, and all philosophical, sociological, and anthropological elaborations will be temporalized, materialized, and will be as fragile and relative to time as the resistance of a wooden log. Of course, we are saying in this case that taking Marxist materialism to its consequences leads to a private meaning of words. Now every linguist knows that there is no private meaning of words. I cannot beat someone and say that this is charity and love. I cannot persecute people and call it democracy. And people, usually drowned in daily politics, do not perceive the real problem of treating these issues this way. Some even support it without glimpsing the long-term problem. And what is the problem? It is that the relativization of words, their private definition, incapacitates us from making a correct diagnosis of society. Imagine you go to the doctor with a blown-out knee. You've torn your meniscus and all the ligaments in your knee. The doctor then tells you that you are feeling knee pain because you have worms in your brain and need urgent surgery. He justifies that the knee and meniscus are brain parts and refers you to a friend who performs this surgery and makes a high annual profit. You pay and have the surgery. What's the result? Your knee will probably get worse. You will lose money and a piece of your brain. In science, concepts are solid or almost solid. This is what increases predictability and trust. The definition of energy in astrophysics is one and the same. This makes experiments replicable and theses knowable. If with every new scientific article published we have a new definition for energy, and I can invent 3 or 4 at any time, the results are chaotic. Predictability cannot be achieved without falsifiability and knowability. In fact, the application of materialism to signs and language produces almost private concepts, temporalized concepts. Marxism, a political philosophy of praxis, finds conceptual manipulation convenient for the conquest, maintenance, and exercise of power. This is because in materialism there is no conceptual foundation, because there are no universals in Marxism. There is no Platonic superlunar world. There is no root for fixing concepts or social valuations. They are historical, cultural, and social constructions. This is indeed the case. That is, the accusation that Marxists make against their surroundings applies to what they themselves are producing, because they are overly materialistic and project even the mistakes they have within themselves onto the external world. The cognitive dissonance inherent to the communist cognitive dissonance is a concept in psychology by Leon Festinger that describes the feeling of discomfort or mental conflict that arises when a person holds contradictory beliefs, attitudes, or values. We all experience cognitive dissonance, and we usually try to resolve the internal conflict. Imagine you are a person who identifies as a lover of communism and firmly believes in its ideals of social equality and justice. However, you also have historical knowledge and recognize that in some situations, communist regimes result in genocides and serious human rights violations. In this case, your belief in communism as an ideal comes into conflict with the knowledge of historical events. This contradiction generates cognitive dissonance in many people. To resolve this internal conflict unconsciously, people tend to adopt different actions. For example, some try to minimize the importance of genocides, arguing that they were isolated cases or distortions of true communism. They try not to think about these crimes and act and think as if they had never happened. Other people try to rework communism, customizing it, seeking parallel interpretations more compatible with their moral and ethical values. Still others try to find evidence that communism is peaceful, good, and respects life, citing isolated, cherry-picked, and unrealistic cases. There are also those who accept the genocides, minimizing their moral and ethical preferences to eliminate cognitive dissonance. The problem begins when this communist, who has understood communism and Marxism, or at least absorbed materialism. In this given example, the materialist communist would resolve the cognitive dissonance by simply denying their own moral and ethical dimension, treating them as mere historical and social elements produced by relations of production or by the superstructure or by the structure. It is even intuitive that our hypothetical materialist communist's choice would be the fourth, to accept the genocides, minimizing their own moral and ethical preferences to eliminate cognitive dissonance, to think, for example, as a communist. Colleague once told me, "You can't make an omelette without breaking a few eggs," he said, laughing. Concluding the problem of materialism stems from the fact that materialism has no absolute moral basis. As any absolute moral basis can only be founded in the transcendental dimension, and as we know, materialism denies the existence of the transcendental dimension and is anti-idealist. Trofim Lysenko can affirm that Mendel's science is bourgeois, and propose a pseudoscience called proletarian science and lead hundreds of thousands of people to their death. Marxists can affirm that there is a Western science and an Eastern science, criticizing economic, biological, or any other science, when its results contradict the political vanities of Marxist leaders. However, this same group will side with science when it serves them as a political tool. If science makes it possible to increase bureaucracy and state power, then they will be in favor of science, even if it means corroborating and working for the inordinate billion-dollar profits of, for example, large pharmaceutical companies owned by the largest living capitalists. In effect, communism will always be an ideology of death, hypocrisy, lies, manipulation, idiocy, materialism, hatred, and genocide, and there is no need to test it in the almost 200 officially recognized countries today to then attest to its imminent failure and bloodshed in all of them to know that all this is flawed. Indeed, Europe and the countries of the Northern Hemisphere already know this, and in Latin America, a region with at least 60 years of delay, we see such defended ideas persist. Furthermore, taking materialism to its ultimate consequences, we conclude that everything that exists in the universe is composed of matter and energy. In this view, the human mind is nothing more than a product of the brain's functioning, without any independent existence, relative to the whim of culture, history, and society. Emotions, thoughts, and consciousness are the results of complex biochemical processes that occur within our organism. This materialist perspective implies that there is no room for the existence of any entity or force beyond the physical world. Therefore, there is no place for the existence of gods, spirits, or any form of divinity. Life and the universe are explained solely in terms of natural laws and purely material processes. There are several critics of materialism who point out a series of errors in this approach. One of the main arguments is the problem of consciousness, which cannot be fully explained by material processes. They question how something as subjective and personal as conscious experience could arise solely from interacting atoms and molecules. My favorite color is red, and that is idiosyncratic. Where, then, is this taste of mine? It certainly would not be possible to clone me and clone a series of idiosyncratic elements along with me, nor could my memory be cloned, for memory is not merely conserved data. It is not material, it is also a process of recreation, a topic dealt with by Philippe Frimaud, one of the founders of French concrete philosophy. Human consciousness is also not material. You cannot put human consciousness on a flash drive. Furthermore, the way I evaluate products and buy them cannot be materialized or cloned, and here we refer to the detail. It's either 100% materialized or not. So, materialism, being a monist doctrine, is flawed. It's one or the other. Marx said that the exchange value or the value of a commodity is defined by the amount of socially necessary labor to produce it. That is, he believed that the amount of labor necessary to produce an object has an intrinsic value that is derivatively attributed to the product. But where is the consumer's taste and judgment? Marx's economics does not include the consumer because their valuation is material and does not fit within his materialist reductionism. I would never pay more than R10 for a single banana under normal conditions, but many people would. And this does not stem from a lack of purchasing power, but from an aesthetic taste, a certain appreciation of art that is idiosyncratic. Therefore, the amount of socially necessary labor to produce a lot of things in the world is not important. Many of them will have no value for me, and so it is for all consumers. In short, the complexity of the universe and living beings, which goes beyond mere matter in motion, cannot be explained by materialism, which leaves countless absurd gaps. For these and other reasons, materialism, communism, and Marxism are problematic. Well, dear listener, perhaps I have forgotten some important reflections on this topic and its problems. If you know of anything, please leave it in the comments. Support the channel, subscribe, and share. A hug and see you in the next video.